November 17th, 1869 ushered in a new age for Africa with the construction of the Suez Canal. Linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas, it shortened travel from Britain to the Indian Ocean by 6,000 kilometers. Africa at this time was linked with scattered coastal trade posts, bastions of the Indian and former Atlantic trading networks. As the expanding European empires required natural resources to fuel their battleships, steel mills, and commodity markets, the rumored mineral riches of Africa began to attract attention. Political tensions between European powers were steadily building, and border frictions, such as along the German-French border, increased. European rulers sought outlets for this tension to preserve the stability of their countries and rule. The fervent anti-slavery movements in the 1860s had left European powers aghast at the remnants and injustices of the slave trade still persisting in Africa, and moral justification for conquest formed out of desire to end these injustices. Explorers such as Dr. Livingstone brought behind them the great powers of Europe, mobilizing their militaries and populations for a scramble to the dark continent of Africa. By November 15th, 1884, the great colonial powers were driving into the interior of the continent at full force, spearheaded by the Belgian king Leopold II. As Belgium had no room to expand within Europe, being sandwiched between France and Germany, Leopold II decided to attempt parity with other European nations by landing thousands of settlers and troops at the Congo in 1883. The scramble quickly became apparent as France, Britain, and Germany all began landing troops along the West African coast. As the British pushed north from the Cape of Good Hope, discoveries of gold and diamonds sent the already frenetic pace even faster. Egypt fell to Britain through debt resulting in financial collapse, and the British Empire moved in troops to secure the Suez Canal, resulting in the annexation of all of Egypt and the Sudan. With Portugal wanting to unite its Angolan and Mozambican colonies by annexing Rhodesia between them, Britain wanting to unite the Sudanese and South African colonies through the same lands, France looking to consume the last independent nations of North Africa, and colonial war seeming increasingly likely as territorial tensions grew ever greater, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany invited 14 great powers on the 15th of November to a conference in Berlin.
The Berlin Conference. What is the Berlin Conference? By the mid-19th century, Europeans had established colonies all along the African coast and competed for control. The push for overseas territories was made even more intense by the Industrial Revolution and the need for cheap labor, raw material, and new markets. The competition between Europeans often led to violent conflict. The conference was held in Berlin between November 15, 1884 and November 26, 1885 under the leadership of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. At the time of the conference, 80% of Africa remained under the traditional and local control. The focus of the conference was controlling the slave trade and promoting humanitarian idealism, but the conference was only passed as empty resolutions about the ending of slave trade and providing welfare for Africa. In truth, the result of the conference was a method of dividing the continent of Africa between the European powers. Article 34 of the Berlin Act. It stated that any European nation that took possession of an African coast had to inform the other powers of the Berlin Act of this action. If this was not done, then their claim would not be recognized. This act introduced the sphere of influence doctrine. The control of the coastline also meant that they would control the interior to an almost unlimited distance, which gives more advantage to Europeans on industrial natural resources and raw materials. The conference lasted until February 26, 1885, a 3-month period, where colonial powers determined the boundaries in the interior of the continent, disregarding the cultural and linguistic boundary already established by the African population. Yet Article 35 determined that in order to occupy a coastal possession, the nation also had to prove that they controlled sufficient authority to protect existing rights, including freedom of trade and some basic human rights. The reason for the Berlin Act is to create rule for efficient occupation for the conquered land, ensuring that the division of Africa would take place without war among the European powers. Through the Berlin Act, the European powers justified dividing a continent among themselves without considering the desire or pre-existing conflicts between indigenous people, because of its size, surface, feature, climate, resources, and strategic importance. Africa became a prime candidate for conquest by ambitious European empires. The effect of the conference in terms of social sphere, the European domination took the traditional African values and costume. They also tarnished the existing social relationship when they provided Africans with education. As a result, all the European cultural influence, including the civilizing mission, ruined the existing African social orders. From the education that Europeans provided to the indigenous people and the imperialism that Europeans think is highly idealized fashion, a regional African society was at corruption. When the British took over a territory, or so argument went, they think they brought civilization to the barbarians and Enlightenment ideas to them.
New Year's Eve 1913 brought to a close the frenetic colonization of Africa under the shadow of a conflict even greater. As the European economies needed more and more natural resources to feed manufactories and heavy industry, Africa became blanketed with exporting infrastructure running mine to port, nothing else. This shows geographically through colonial borders, for example, the Belgian Congo's coastline and the seemingly arbitrary borders of the German Cameroons and Caprivi Strip, among others. However, as Africa has been carved up into an export-focused economy, little care was given to its inhabitants. Deployments of cartridge rifles and machine guns onto the continent resulted in horrific death tolls for the indigenous populations, and unfortunately for the remaining population, atrocities were conducted to those who did not meet their production quotas for their new colonial masters. Chief among these were the treatment of Africans in the Belgian Congo by Leopold II. Mutilation and public execution were common punishments to those who could not produce enough rubber. The social order in Africa was henceforth destroyed by colonial powers. The European empires of France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, and Italy had achieved their goals of resource extraction at great cost to Africans themselves. However, with Balkan relationships deteriorating, these empires began to gaze upon the colonies of the others with a renewed eye for conquest once more.